a Friends of Canadian Broadcasting podcast.
Hello, it's Ian Morrison here with the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. In this edition of our podcast, we feature a video interview on ichannel's Public Affairs program At Issue on February 14. Joining me in that discussion of Canadian broadcasting regulation from a viewer perspective is media consultant Jim MacDonald and At Issue's host, Patrick Boyer. The issues we cover are topical given the upcoming CRTC public hearing on possible rule changes for an increasingly powerful segment of the broadcasting industry, cable monopolies and satellite companies. In CRTC speak, they are known as Broadcast Distribution Undertakings, or BDUs. Friends will be appearing before the CRTC on April 8th, the opening day of a 3-week public hearing. You can keep up to date on the hearing and our input by visiting our website, www.friends.ca, in early April for more information. But for now, please enjoy the following program. It has been edited from its original length and runs approximately 30 minutes.
Welcome to At Issue. I'm Patrick Boyer. As somebody watching television, you know how this medium helps express our culture, helps us understand what is going on around us and take our bearings. But there's also a story behind the story of what you see on the screen. When Parliament enacted the Broadcasting Act to set national goals, it also created a regulatory agency, the CRTC, to ensure that the stated public purposes of Canadian broadcasting would become a reality. Right now, the CRTC is holding important public hearings to consider new policies for Canadian broadcasting's cable and satellite systems. Now, the big players participate in these hearings, but mostly the public does not, and the media do not always cover the issues that affect you. So, here at ichannel, we're looking behind the scene of broadcasting regulation. We have 4 programs on the issues involved, seen from the perspectives of the creators, the broadcasters, the providers, and the viewers. This next hour looks at your position, the viewer of television. I'm joined now in our ichannel studios by Jim MacDonald, long involved in broadcasting and communications, manager of Bell Canada's acquisition of CTV, and now a consultant to those fortunate enough to retain his services. And by Ian Morrison, spokesperson for Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Patrick.
Ian, Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, this just, you want to join, right? So tell us about this organization, the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting.
Millions of people have managed to refrain from doing that, but about 100,000 Canadians support its work. It's a watchdog for Canadian content on radio and television.
So the mandate then is to see that there is the presence of the Canadian identity on our television screens?
The quality and the quantity of Canadian programming. That's our mission. And among the groups we keep an eye on is the CRTC.
So how do you go about that?
Well, research, public opinion surveys from time to time. We're present, we monitor, we mobilize the grassroots Canadians to speak up when big behind-the-scenes interests are dominating the CRTC agenda. We do things like that.
Well, Jim, you're obviously a friend of Canadian broadcasting in many, many ways. And although I mentioned that significant role that you had in connection with CTV and Bell, there's also this perspective of the individual viewer that I know you are focused on quite a lot. In your experience, what's been changing for the viewers of Canadian television in the last decade or so?
Well, I think probably the biggest change is it's gotten a lot more popular. The quality of Canadian programming has improved. You've seen that there have been significant successes. Programming that is now in the top 20. I mean, it's popular programming as opposed to programs that were done to fulfill regulatory requirements. And actually, that was one of the commitments that was made at the CTV transfer of ownership. And that said, CTV went in, or BCE, I should say, as part of the benefits, and said, first of all, let us control some of the spending. Let us work with the producers, and we can greenlight a project, we can develop a project, greenlight a project, promote it properly, and that's exactly what they've done, and they've been tremendously successful with shows like Corner Gas as an example.
Right, right. So these increased number of shows and viewership, I'm interested to hear that, because I'd heard some stats that made me think that the number of people who are watching television was declining, and the audiences were shrinking, and I just assumed that that was because more people, if they had time to be looking at any kind of screen at all, were looking at, say, computer screens where they could get a lot of information and entertainment as well. What's happening in that balance?
Patrick, there's no question that there is fragmentation that has happened as a result of additional services that have been licensed or brought into Canada, but and there's no question that as a result of that, the top programs are generating a smaller overall audience. But if you look at Canadian programs in particular, there are ones that are showing up on the radar, and in some cases quite successfully. And that is a significant difference from what we've seen before. And it's also, I think, significant that we're able to do that with the kind of production budgets that can exist in Canada versus the typical US budget that's probably 10 times the size.
Do either of you see a parallel with that and what happened before when the CRTC required Canadian music to be broadcast, Canadian content, and the burgeoning of the Canadian music industry, including international fame and recognition of our music, our musicians and our performing artists. Do you see, are these shows that you're talking about winning an international market?
Well, some of them are. I mean, you just saw last week that CTV announced 2 of their programs had been picked up, one by CBS and I believe the other by ABC, for the international distribution. Now, that may have, in part, have been aided by the fact that the writers' strike had put them at a little bit of a disadvantage, but who cares, as long as it gets out there and gets the exposure. So there's no question in my mind that the quality issue is what's at task, and you know, that we're moving in the right direction.
But Jim, just to explore Patrick's comment about the analogy to the music business in Canada, I mean, back in the early 1970s, the CRTC stepped in and established minimum amounts of Canadian content for Canadian music. We now have an extremely strong and flourishing industry, and I think the point in common with the television hearing that you mentioned in the introduction is that regulation can facilitate markets. It's not always a bad thing, and the success of the Canadian music industry is a direct result of interventions. In fact, the reason we have the Juno Awards, it's named in honor of Pierre Junot, who was the chair of the CRTC when those regulations came. Yeah, the music business.
It's a great Canadian moment. We name an award after a civil servant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Peace, order, and good regulation. Well, this issue of regulation is significant because the big hearings that are coming up in April of 2008 with where the CRTC will be holding hearings, public hearings, on the role of the distributors of these signals to viewers. There is happening in a context where some people are saying, well, there should be a lighter hand of regulation, and there are also people that are arguing that there's now the regulated side of the traditional broadcasting, but there's the unregulated side, the internet and everything that you can get there. And in fact, there's connection between the two because broadcasters carry their news and so on the internet as well. What do you see as Friends of Canadian Broadcasting from the perspective of the individual citizen in this regulatory framework? Is something going to change significantly here? Can some of these forces be regulated? Because I got the idea, Jim, just to finish this question, that you were almost saying that some of these great recent television productions were coming not so much because of regulation that mandated it, but because of other factors that encouraged it.
I think it's a combination of both. But I want to go back to, if I may, just on the whole quantity issue, because the quantity versus quality question has been there almost since the beginning of time. And Ian very correctly talked about the regulatory environment that created the music business, and having been in the record industry at that time, I would totally agree with him. But a lot of Canadians had fatigue from listening to the same music over and over and over again because we didn't have enough. Now, the question is, what is enough? I mean, what's that arbitrary number?
Fatigue as a spur to creativity. Yeah.
But we grew into it, and again, we have content rules that still question that quality versus quantity, because there's only so much money, and how much can you actually do with it? But I think that the regulatory environment is a pretty important aspect of. I mean, if it didn't, there's an old adage of course, what gets measured gets done, and it's very expensive to produce really good Canadian programming that can compete in an international marketplace. And there are those that argue that if we had to produce less quantity, we could produce better quality.
So from the viewer's point of view, how does she or he have any say or influence over that? Or is it something that is simply you're a passive recipient of whatever comes up on the screen?
Well,
is there a feedback loop in this?
Jim was giving you feedback from a small f friend of Canadian Broadcasting. I'll speak for the capital F
the organization that lobbies for Canadian content.
First off, I would say that you said some have said that we need a lighter hand in regulation. I'd like to put some identification on those some. The Conservative Party of Canada in the 2006 election campaign sent a note out to all its candidates saying, with respect to the CRTC, we intend to relax and reduce the role of the CRTC in Canadian content regulation where other measures apply, whatever that means. And when the CRTC itself put out the call for this broadcast distribution and specialty channel hearing process, I read in their, Jim can speak for himself, but I read in their call for comments a general statement, it really behooves the people who think that continuing the regulation we have is worthwhile. It behooves them to prove it. Otherwise, our inclination is to reduce the regulation. And our radar went blip, blip, blip on that because we feel that the whole body of Canadian television broadcasting today, where there's strong Canadian content, has come as a result of CRTC measures.
Well, I'm glad you raised that. I actually think that there's a continuity here, because under Prime Minister Martin's government as well, there had been efforts to lighten the regulatory burden in Ottawa. So I'm not sure if what we're looking at is something that's a difference or a distinction between political parties as much as it is an emerging climate in the country in relation to how effective the regulatory framework is.
Well, you just used a word that I approve of there. We need effective regulation. We need necessary, not necessarily regulation, but regulation if necessary. The regulation is, if regulation is accomplishing something, my colleague just said, if you can't measure it, you know. If regulation is accomplishing something useful, then it's up to us to defend that regulation. And so the process of this hearing has been a chance to answer that CRTC question. Perhaps the CRTC was just trying to tease that out from the public.
Well, we'll see. I mean, here would be the answer. What do viewers want? You know, I mean, we talk about the regulatory framework, right? That's the context within which the play is conducted. But from the perspective of the viewers, what do viewers want from television now? I mean, you're studying this all the time, right?
I mentioned to you earlier that occasionally we would commission a public opinion poll. We've been doing that since the early 90s. When you ask viewers what's more important to them, having programs repeated at popular times, having more channels available, or having better quality programming, the vast majority will say better quality programming. Now, of course, what does that mean, you know? But viewers do want that, and viewers, when you ask them if there should be a minimum amount of Canadian content stipulated for Canadian television, they will say yes. And if you say, well, is 1 in 4 hours enough? They will say no. I know that from research.
Mm-hmm. Well, do they talk about choice? Does that come up in these surveys that you do about the choice that people want?
We have such a great choice in the Canadian broadcasting system. We have, if you pay for them, hundreds of channels. We get channels from around the world. We have a lot of Canadian channels too, and it's amazing the choice we have. In fact, typically, Jim, you might know more about this than I do, but I would say the typical Canadian has a lot more choice in what they receive on television than the typical American.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, because aside from anything else, we have all of the U.S. channels plus all of the Canadian channels. And in addition to that, we have time shifting and station shifting and multiple choices that are not typically available to U.S. clients.
Somebody might,
or viewers, I should say.
Somebody listening might say, well, what about HBO or something like that? But what you'll find if you analyze the HBO schedule, the content that HBO broadcasts, the vast majority of that is broadcast by Canadian rights holders. The reason HBO isn't allowed in is because it would be breaching copyright it would be stealing from people who own the Canadian rights to those shows, you see. But we have a lot of choice in Canada.
Maclean's magazine has been on a crusade for a year or two to have HBO in Canada. Clarify the issue again, why home box office is not available to Canadians?
I mean, Maclean's magazine's owner, Rogers Communications, would not be happy if people stole their copyright on things. But maybe I'm talking too much, Jim.
Well, what Ian is saying is that if you look at all of the top channels in the United States that are not currently here, like HBO, like USA Cable, things like that, these are services that are well known to Canadians, and if you asked the average one, would you like it? Of course they're going to say, yes, we'd like to see HBO. But what Ian is saying incorrectly is that the vast majority of programming that is on USA or on HBO has been licensed by Canadian specialty services and is therefore available. Anyway. Yeah. In fact,
search for it.
One of the interventions I remember reading had indicated that less than 2% of all of the top U.S. programming, specialty programming, less than 2% is not available.
Is this likely to become a viewer or consumer driven system?
Well, I see it as becoming a distributor controlled system. It's not visible.
In the name of choice for...
Well, number one, none of these big monopolies wants competition from their American counterparts. None of them are advocating competition in the sense of let Time Warner or Comcast come into Canada and compete with them house by house. So their Parliament has privileged them from American competition in the area of distribution. But it's very hard for you or me as a viewer to really be on top of what we do get to see and do not get to see on our television screens. And what we tend to notice is that services in which the monopoly has an interest will be favored over services in which the monopoly does not have an interest. Now, the ones they don't have an interest in might be powerful things like CTV, TSN, that big empire. But independent, smaller television providers, they're really at a disadvantage. And that is just not visible to the viewer out there. How do you know what you don't get to see?
Yes.
See?
Well, how is that dilemma likely to change? Is it going to get? I mean, it's not that there isn't Canadian production. It's that they're linked to the audience, right? And it's going through this increasingly narrow.
Three or four Canadians effectively get to make decisions about what we do and do not see.
Well, it strikes me, and I invite your comment on this, Jim, that this is becoming more than just a regulatory matter, the way that Ian has outlined it, that this is really going to the larger, deeper question about Canada as a democracy. Who is owning the means that determine what we see on the screen, what you're watching on the screen? If it's down to a narrow handful of very powerful people that own a lot of other media.
Well, it is an interesting question right now, Patrick, because I think if you ask the average Canadian whether they wanted to be regulated by the CRTC, they'd say no. They say, I want to have unfettered access to whatever I want. I want all those U.S. shows. I want all this. Well, which is not to say they don't want their local Canadian programming. They do want that too, but they do not like being told they can't see something. And then it starts to, then you have to look at, okay, well, at what point does regulation kick in? At what point is regulation a good thing? At what point is public policy a good thing? And as Ian was talking about earlier, the CRTC has done a tremendous amount if you're looking at it from a public policy perspective. But if public policy goes out the window, then of course you can take the whole CRTC and do the same thing with it. I guess what I'm really trying to say is that public policy and how much or how important it is going to be, in my view, a very, very big part of this hearing. And the CRTC are going to have to decide whether it's going to be completely market-driven or whether it's going to be public policy-driven or it's going to be a combination of both.
Well, suppose it takes that former approach. Suppose the CRTC basically listens to what the BDUs are urging on them and were to implement that. How would that affect what Canadians see and are able to do in relation to television?
I would think that the typical viewer is aware, conceptually, that it costs money to make good programming. I mean, that's pretty elementary, right? So right now, the money that the various distributors, the Shaws, the Rogers, the Bell Express Hughes, collect from their subscribers, a certain amount of it flows back to the specialty or pay channels that people are receiving. And in fact, when you add it all up, now Jim can correct me, but I believe it's something in the mid to high 80% of the money that's collected and passed on to television creators or producers. That money is mostly going into Canadian hands. And one or more of the distributors has proposed that ratio should be anything above 51% would be okay. And we did a little calculation of what the difference between 88 and 51 is, and it came out to many hundreds of $1 million a year that would be taken out of the Canadian broadcasting system and presumably would either go into the hands of the distributors themselves or be passed on to Hollywood.
I guess I'm asking about, are we getting some kind of corporate level groupthink that's possible because you only have a very common type of ownership rather than diversity and wide range of ownership?
Patrick, I honestly don't believe that the average consumer out there cares a toot who owns the channel. They just want to be able to watch the channels that they want to see. And you often hear people complain about the fact that they're paying for services that they don't want. In other words, in this package of services that I want, I like this one and this one, but I don't like this, this, or this. But I have no choice. I have to get them all. Those are some of the public policy.
Like you subscribe to a magazine, and it may have 4 articles you want to read and 13 that you don't want to read, right?
That's a fair analogy.
The staple is the same as the tier, isn't it?
But and cable, as I said, to offer a balance here, have advocated for that kind of individual ability to select programming. But they want to really control the tiers and how they're put together. So the real crosshairs here to me is at this hearing, because you wanted to get back to the hearing, is what ultimately is the consumer-driven side of it and the public policy-driven side of it, and where do the twain meet? And I do not believe that the Commission will abandon the public policy side in favor of, as it's been called, market forces.
Well, could I even ask this? Is there anything in the current regulations of the CRTC that prevents the broadcasters and certainly the distributors from doing some of the things that they now claim that they want to do? Are they really that hemmed in?
The tiering and linkage rules, as they exist right now, do require a certain, carriage of certain channels based on really, as you know, when the channels were licensed, and those channels typically were part and parcel of packages and/or tiers, and there are tiering and linkage rules, which.
Right,
probably
just so viewers understand, that would be like iChannel is in a tier 1, so it has to be carried with certain other programs, right?
Whereas iChannel is a category 1.
Category 1, so it's in tier 1.
And is required to be carried as a category 1.
Whereas a couple of others, a lot of others are in a second category, and they're more optional, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Stornoway also owns a pet channel, and that's a Category 2 service, and so it is carried only if you reach an accord with the BDU.
But if I could just jump in and sort of cut to the chase, I'd say,
cut to the chase, because this is our last 30 seconds.
Never mind the concepts. I would say it's very important, in our judgment, for the Canadian broadcasting system that smaller, independent companies have access. And basically, we're moving towards a more concentrated role where CTV and CanWest and a few others own huge stables of specialty channels, and some of the distributors own them too. But in our judgment, the Stornoways, the Vision TVs, that I could name about 8 or 10, but that'd be it, the independent ones. And we want the CRTC to protect their access to the airwaves.
Well, thank you. That's a great note on which to round out our 4-part series. I just want to say that, for information that's current about what the CRTC is doing, you can visit their website, www.crtc.gc.ca, or you can visit our website at www.ichannel.ca. I certainly want to thank you both Ian Morrison and Jim McDonald for being part of this program, looking at the viewers' interest in this great and complex issue that's now under debate and awaiting further resolution in Canada.
Thanks for watching. Also, a special thank you to Stornoway Communications for permission to use iChannel's at issue footage. All the best.